So fellas, it's pretty common knowledge that the sport of MMA, and specifically the UFC, has evolved massively over the years, but I want to know how much it's evolved compared to 5 years ago in the 2020 era of the UFC, which was, I think this was a really good time for the UFC, you know, just before the COVID era / just at the beginning of the COVID era when we were having these big fights, and I'd actually say I thought from like 2016 to the beginning of 2020 was probably the golden era of the UFC. So I want to see how the top 5 in every weight class now would fare against the top 5 5 years ago. See how much the sport have evolved. All the contenders now are much more skilled than the contenders 5 years ago. And we'll start off with the heavyweight division, with the heavyweight champion being Stipe Miocic versus Jones now. Now, obviously, we just saw this fight at UFC 309. And even though obviously 2020 Stipe Miocic was in a much better career spot than he was when he fought Jones recently, it's still definitely not prime Stipe, which is actually crazy when you really put into perspective the fact that Jones fought Stipe in late 2024. But no, I'm going to pick Jones to win this fight. Yes, it would probably be more difficult considering the career stage that Stipe was at in 2020 compared to 2024, but you know, he still wasn't prime Stipe. When he fought DC, when he was in the heavyweight division fighting Ngannou, he wasn't terrible. He wasn't as washed as he was now, but he definitely wasn't in his prime, and I feel like John Jones, as of right now, would find a way to win because it's still arguably the best heavyweight in the world. I know a lot of people are going to say Tom Aspinall, which we'll get onto, and I still think it is Tom Aspinall, but considering he's the heavyweight champion, man, you know, it's John Jones at the end of the day. I'm going to pick him to beat 2020 Stipe. Maybe prime Stipe is a completely different story, but 2020 Stipe, the one that fought Ngannou in DC, I'm going to pick John Jones as of right now to beat him. And then we've got DC versus Tom Aspinall. Again, this isn't prime DC. We're not talking about prime DC. We're talking about 2020 DC, and I'm going to be honest, 2020 DC looked horrible. He looked terrible in that fight with Stipe Miocic, the trilogy with Stipe in the Apex at the beginning of 2020. DC looked awful in that fight, and that's why he rightfully retired. And you put him in against one of the most dangerous heavyweights, and at least the most skilled heavyweight of the modern generation. Listen, DC in his prime could have given Tom Aspinall a really tough fight because of the wrestling and how good of a fighter he was, but we're talking about 2020 DC. He gets knocked out by Tom Aspinall. He was getting caught against Stipe Miocic. It was a very messy fight with a bunch of eye pokes. It wasn't really good to see, and it was kind of like a waking call for DC to retire. You put him against Tom Aspinall, getting knocked out, so I'm picking current Aspinall to beat 2020 DC. 2020 Francis Ngannou versus current Cyril Gane. Now, we saw this fight in 2022 with Ngannou versus Cyril Gane. Obviously, now Cyril Gane's kind of evolved, and obviously 2020 Francis Ngannou. But listen, I think 2020 Francis Ngannou is arguably better than the Ngannou today. The Francis Ngannou that fought Stipe Miocic looked like he was on a completely different level. So I'm going to pick him to beat Cyril Gane as well. Now, I know Cyril Gane's improved his wrestling compared to the fight with Francis Ngannou, and he kind of showed that in the fight with Alexander Volkov. But again, I still felt like when you put in Francis Ngannou ahead of him, you can also argue that there was a bunch of knee injuries that he had coming into that fight with Cyril Gane. It is a close fight, especially if we're talking about the Cyril Gane of today, but I'm still going to go with Francis Ngannou. I think the striking of Ngannou, the fact that he can mix it up with the wrestling, and then we just saw current Cyril Gane technically lose to Alexander Volkov. I'm not picking him to beat 2020 Ngannou, so I'm going to go with 2020 Francis Ngannou to beat current Cyril Gane. And then we've got Curtis Blades from 2020 versus current Alexander Volkov. Now, we've seen these guys fight. I think it was back in 2020 or something when they fought, but obviously we're talking about current Volkov when I think he's into the best stage of his career, and I'm going to go with Volkov to win. I know they fought a couple of years ago, but I feel like Curtis Blades is in a much better career spot than he is now compared to a few years ago. And Alexander Volkov's massively developed, specifically since the Tom Aspinall fight. He seems to be he just seems to be a lot better on the feet. He's definitely improved his wrestling, as he showed in the fight with Tui Vaz, and specifically the fight with Cyril Gane. He's a lot more cautious, but a lot more technical on the feet, as he showed against Sergey Pavlovich. And I feel like Volkov is honestly hit like a second career prime. He should have beaten Cyril Gane and should have been on a 5-fight winning streak. So I'm going to pick current Alexander Volkov to beat 2020 Curtis Blades. Maybe current Blades is a different story, but 2020 or current Alexander Volkov versus 2020 Blades, I'm going to go with Volkov. I think he's a massively underrated fighter. And then Junior Dos Santos versus Sergey Pavlovich. Yeah, this was when Junior Dos Santos was at the right end of his career. I'm going to go Sergey Pavlovich to KO him in the first round. He just would have been another Sergey Pavlovich victim. Unfortunately for Junior Dos Santos, he was in no position to continue fighting back in 2020. I mean, I know he's gone to do like bare knuckle MMA fighting on Masvidal's promotion, so fair play to him. But against Sergey Pavlovich, he gets stopped in the first round. I'm going to current Sergey Pavlovich to beat Junior Dos Santos. And Pavlovich has the wrestling too, as he showed against, what's his name, Rosenstrike. So that's how the heavyweights 5 years ago would match up against the current heavyweights today. So apart from Francis Ngannou, I wouldn't favour any of the heavyweights from 5 years ago to beat any of the top 5 ever today. I know there's a couple of controversial ones in there with, Stipe and Jones maybe, and a couple of other guys, but I do think apart from Ngannou, most of today's heavyweights would run through the heavyweights from 5 years ago. And then the light heavyweight division. Jon Jones in 2020 versus current Alex Pereira. Now, I've always said that Jon Jones is a terrible matchup for Alex Pereira, and if these guys were to ever fight, Jones would take him down and submitting him, do whatever he wants because it's Jon Jones. But if we're talking about 2020 Jones, the Jones that fought Dominic Reyes, I think current Poaton, with the improved takedown defense, the improved grappling, and just how dangerous he's on the feet, I'm probably going to favour Poaton to win. Jones didn't win the fight against Dominic Reyes. He was getting beaten up by Dominic Reyes. I'm not saying he got dominated. It was a close fight, obviously. But I thought Reyes, and a lot of people thought Reyes won that fight, and Reyes looked very good. And I can only imagine that Alex Pereira, like I said, with the improved takedown defense, and with how dangerous he is on the feet, and he's probably the best light heavyweight of this generation, I'm going to lean towards Alex winning. Yes, heavyweight Jones versus Alex is a different story. And prime Jon Jones back in like early 2010s would have been a different story. But if we could talk about 2020 Jones, the one that was fighting the likes of, what's his name, Thiago Santos and Dominic Reyes, I'm picking Alex Pereira as of right now to beat him. I think Poaton's a terrible, well, not a terrible matchup for Jon Jones, but again, Jones didn't look good against Reyes. I'm picking current Alex to beat Jon Jones. And then we've got Dominic Reyes versus Magomed Ankalaev. Another tough one, but again, Dominic Reyes was able to beat Jon Jones. He looked pretty good in that fight too. Decent wrestling, decent takedown, pretty good takedown defense as well when you take into account that he's fighting Jones, who's a better wrestler than Ankalaev. And the fact that his hands were flying in that fight, he had a really good boxing. I'm going to pick Dominic Reyes to beat Magomed Ankalaev. Maybe after this weekend, that's a bit of a, a bit of a bad take, but considering the fact that he was able to beat Jon Jones, he looked really good with the takedown defense. His hands looked really crisp as well. I think he outpoints Magomed Ankalaev across 5 rounds. I don't know if he finishes Ankalaev or not because Ankalaev has good striking, but I know a lot of people are going to use the whole chinny argument against Dominic Reyes, but Ankalaev, I think he's kind of got a little bit of overrated, maybe not overrated power because it's not like he gets talked about because of his power a lot, but I mean, apart from knocking out Johnny Walker, Ian Cutelaba, and a couple other guys, who is he really knocked out? Like, he couldn't wobble Jan Blachowicz on the feet. He couldn't wobble Alexander Rakic on the feet. He hasn't beaten any of the top light heavyweights of today's generation. So I'm going to pick 2020 Dominic Reyes that beat Jon Jones to beat Magomed Ankalaev. And hopefully that's not a controversial take and shouldn't be. But maybe after this weekend it is anyway. Next, we've got Thiago Santos versus Yuri. Santos was still putting up tough fights towards the end of his light heavyweight career, but I'm going to pick Yuri to win. Unless Yuri gets clipped because of his kind of, his very unorthodox, defensively not sound style, and, he gets caught by a big shot by Thiago Santos. I do think Yuri would break him in this fight. Thiago Santos, who was getting broken by the likes of Jamal Hill, and I know that was a little bit later on, but 2020 Thiago Santos against current Yuri Prochazka, I think Yuri Prochazka finishes him. One of the most crafty, weird strikers that Thiago Santos would have ever seen, so I'm going to go with Yuri Prochazka to beat Thiago Santos. And then we've got Anthony Smith. Still crazy to think that Anthony Smith was in the top 5 against current Jan Blachowicz. We don't really know how current Jan Blachowicz looks, considering the last time we saw him was back in 2023 when he lost to Alex Pereira, but I'm assuming that Blachowicz isn't completely washed, even though he's obviously not in his prime. And I'm definitely going to be picking Jan Blachowicz to beat Anthony Smith. In no world am I picking Anthony Smith, whether it's in his prime or whenever, to beat Jan Blachowicz. I think Blachowicz is better everywhere the fight goes. He's more dangerous everywhere the fight goes. I reckon he'd stop him within 3. I'm going Jan Blachowicz to beat Anthony Smith. And then we've got Jan Blachowicz from 5 years ago, and he was more so in his prime, versus current Jamal Hill. I'm going to go Jan Blachowicz to win as well. If Jan Blachowicz can beat somebody like Izzy, and I know Izzy and Jamal Hill are completely different fighters, but I can see Jan Blachowicz having success in the wrestling against Jamal Hill. I think from a striking perspective, he'd piece up Jamal Hill too. If he was outlanding Israel Adesanya and looking good on the feet against Israel Adesanya, Jamal Hill is a bit of a sloppy striker. Yes, he's more dangerous than Izzy at light heavyweight, but a bit of a sloppy striker. I'm picking Jan Blachowicz to beat Jamal Hill, especially when Blachowicz was in his prime. So I'm going to go 2020 Jan Blachowicz to beat current Jamal Hill, and again, that's the light heavyweight division. So we can see that 2 of the fighters from 5 years ago with Dominic Reyes and Jan Blachowicz, I think, would have success over today's top 5. But again, I do think a lot of today's top 5 would have success over the light heavyweights 5 years ago. Apart from maybe Ankalaev and Dominic Reyes and Jamal Hill versus Jan Blachowicz, which is ironic because Jan Blachowicz is even in today's top 5. I think today's top 5 mostly would beat the light heavyweights from 5 years ago. And then the middleweight division, which has massively changed in the past couple of years. It's like it's had a completely different revamp. Israel Adesanya in his prime back in 2020 versus current Dricus du Plessis. I might go with Izzy to win this one. I think I'm going to lean towards 2020 Adesanya. Listen, I know that there's a big argument that, Izzy that fought Dricus wasn't washed. The competition just caught up on him, but I really do think it could be a mental thing too. Coming off that loss to Sean Strickland, Adesanya was looking good in that fight with Dricus du Plessis until he got taken down, then obviously submitted. He was winning the fight against Dricus du Plessis. I can only imagine that a 2020 Adesanya, with the takedown defense that he had, and fair enough, it wasn't takedown defense against high-level wrestlers. It was against the likes of Marvin Vettori, but I'm going to go with 2020 Adesanya winning this one. I don't really have a good explanation or reason for it. I'm just leaning towards 2020 Adesanya when he was in his prime, when he was smoking the rest of the middleweight division, when he looked like he had a good takedown defense and he actually wanted to win the fight with his striking rather than just leg kick to a decision. I'm picking him to beat current Dricus du Plessis, and this is kind of based on what I saw against Dricus versus Adesanya at UFC 305, where Adesanya was winning the fight, so I'm going to lean to 2020 Adesanya to beat current Dricus du Plessis. It is a tough one. It's not an easy pick to make, but I'm going to lean towards 2020 Adesanya. And then we had Robert Whittaker from 5 years ago against current Nassourdine Imavov. Again, I'm going to go with Robert Whittaker from 5 years ago. I know Nassourdine Imavov just knocked out Israel Adesanya, a guy that beat Whittaker twice, but I feel like Whittaker would be a much worse matchup for Nassourdine Imavov because of his dynamic striking and the fact that he is just such an elite striker. I'm going to go with Robert Whittaker from 5 years ago to beat current Nassourdine Imavov. I understand the game has changed and it wouldn't be an easy fight for Robert Whittaker. It'd be a very tough fight, but I'm going to go with Whittaker from 5 years ago to beat current Nassourdine Imavov. I think I need to see a little bit more from Imavov. I mean, it was only a couple of years ago, less than 2 years ago, when he got a unanimous decision to buy Sean Strickland. I feel like Robert Whittaker from 5 years ago, who I wouldn't say he's as good as the current Whittaker, but it wasn't like it was on a completely different level 5 years ago. I'm going to go with Whittaker to beat Nassourdine Imavov. And then we've got Paulo Costa from 5 years ago versus current Sean Strickland. There's going to be people that argue that Costa from 5 years ago was a completely different version and a motivated version than the current Costa. I disagree. I just think the competition in the middleweight division might have changed a little bit. So I'm going to go with Sean Strickland to beat Paulo Costa. We obviously saw this fight at UFC 302. It wasn't really close. I know it was a split decision, which was a terrible scorecard, but it wasn't really a close fight. I don't see why it would be any different a couple of years ago. Maybe Paulo Costa might have been on the front foot a little bit more, a little bit more aggressive, but we saw how badly he got beaten by Adesanya back in 2020, and I'm not saying that Strickland's going to put on a beating the same way that Izzy did, but I mean, we've seen the fight. I have no reason to lean towards Costa beating Strickland. I think Strickland's a much better striker. Costa's now ranked number 13th as well, which maybe he was massively overrated back in the day. I'm picking Strickland to beat Paulo Costa, and you look at Costa's resume, he's barely beaten any good fighters. I think his last win was Luke Rockhold, which just says everything you need to know about Costa, so I'm going Strickland. And then we have Jared Cannonier from 5 years ago versus current Khamzat Chimaev. Yeah, Cannonier hadn't even hit his prime 5 years ago. Chimaev's, I mean, he's probably the scariest wrestler in the UFC right now. I'm picking Khamzat Chimaev to take down Jared Cannonier and just maul him in the first round and submit him. I mean, we saw what he just did to Robert Whittaker, which was kind of the fight, but that was the turning point for me when he beat Robert Whittaker in the fashion that he did, taking him down in about 10 seconds and kind of mauling him for the whole round and then eventually getting the submission. I'm picking Chimaev, today's Chimaev, to beat most fighters from 5 years ago, and definitely Jared Cannonier. And then finally, we've got Yoel Romero versus current Adesanya. I mean, we saw the fight 5 years ago. Adesanya won in one of the most boring title fights we've had in history. And I'm going to pick current Adesanya to win this one too. I'm picking current Adesanya to win this one too. Again, even current Adesanya was looking good against Dricus du Plessis and looking good against Nassourdine Imavov until he got caught. And Yoel Romero was not on the front foot. He looked like he didn't want to win that fight when he fought a couple of years ago. So I don't think Yoel Romero would get the finish necessarily. So I'm picking current Izzy to outpoint Yoel Romero. I mean, like I said, we've seen the fight before. There's not much you can really base it off apart from the fight. So I'm going to go with Adesanya to beat Yoel Romero. And again, this is kind of where it starts to change a little bit. We've seen a lot more middleweights from 5 years ago get success over the middleweights today, in my opinion, like Adesanya when he was a champion, like Robert Whittaker. Well, to be honest, that's kind of it. The rest of the middleweights of today's generation, I think, will beat the top 5. But again, middleweight is the division that's changed drastically in the past couple of years. The contenders are massively different. The top 10 to top 15 is massively different. But that's how I would match the middleweights of today against 5 years ago. Then we've got the welterweight division. Prime Usman versus current Belal Muhammad. A massive argument. I mean, there's a big debate about current Usman versus current Belal Muhammad. I'm going to go with Prime Usman to beat Belal Muhammad. I think from a wrestling perspective, Belal Muhammad, I would say, is probably a better technical wrestler than Usman, but I'd say Usman, being the physical specimen that he was in the welterweight division, I think we'll be able to keep the fight standing or even potentially, offer some wrestling offense as it is. And I think on the feet, I know Belal Muhammad has good striking, but I feel like a lot of his striking comes from the takedown defense, takedown threat. And I know you can use the same argument against Usman, but we've seen a lot more dynamic striking from Usman, like breaking Colby Covington's jaw, piecing him up, roughing up Tyrone Woodley on the feet, sending Jorge Masvidal into the shadow realm. I'm picking 2020 Usman, Prime Usman to beat current Belal Muhammad. Belal Muhammad just needs to show me a little bit more. His striking hasn't been... listen, he's not got bad striking as Bilal Muhammad, but the way people are talking about his striking is if he's like Prime Usman. He's not that good. He's got decent boxing up close to set up the takedowns. That's about it. I'm picking Prime Usman to beat current Bilal Muhammad. I've still got to go with Prime Usman. Then we've got Tyron Woodley versus Leon Edwards of today. Yeah, 2020 Woodley was when it started to get really bad for Woodley. He was on his losing streak, eventually got knocked out by Jake Paul, and I think it was 2021. So I'm picking current Leon Edwards to completely piece him up. I know there's an argument that current Leon Edwards is, easily breakable, as you saw against Bilal Muhammad, and Woodley, being a great wrestler, would pose a big threat to Leon Edwards. I disagree. I think in this fight, Leon would keep the fight standing. I think Leon does have kind of underrated takedown defense. He showed it in the fight with Usman. I mean, specifically the third fight with Usman, and even in the second fight with Usman, where he was offering wrestling offense against him. And Woodley was on a massive decline towards the end of his career. Currently, Leon Edwards pieces him up and takes him to a decision. Then we've got Colby Covington from 5 years ago versus current Shavkat Rakhmonov. Now, Colby Covington from 5 years ago was a legitimate contender, fighting for the belt on multiple different occasions. Really good wrestling. Like I said, out-wrestled the likes of Tyron Woodley, completely broke Woodley in that fight, and was a legitimate top contender of the welterweight division. But current Shavkat Rakhmonov, I think, is a proof of the evolution of the welterweight division. Current Shavkat Rakhmonov wins this fight, in my opinion, and I think it's because of the stand-up. I'm not sure that Colby Covington can take Shavkat Rakhmonov down, and even then, I think out of the two of them, the guy with the biggest submission threat would be Shavkat, and the stand-up, I'm going to go with Shavkat as well. I think the only place where I would give Colby the advantage in this fight is the wrestling, and even then, I don't know if he takes Shavkat down and dominates him like he did to a guy like Woodley. I think Shavkat keeps this fight standing, has a lot of success on the feet, would threat a couple of submissions against Colby, and would get the decision win over Colby Covington, maybe even a stoppage. I don't want to keep throwing around the word decision with Shavkat just because he got one decision over Ian Gary, but I'm picking current Shavkat to beat Colby Covington. Then we had Jorge Masvidal from 5 years ago versus current Usman. I'm going to go with Jorge Masvidal from 2020 to beat current Usman. I know this might be a bit of a hot take, but you've got to remember, Jorge Masvidal in 2020 was coming off after his 3-year winning streak in 2019 in his prime, and he put up a really competitive fight against Usman when they fought the first time. He put up a really competitive fight, and that was on a week's notice, and that was prime Usman as well. You're telling me current Usman, who's been inactive, who's a little bit washed, who's on a bit of a losing streak against Masvidal in his prime, potentially with a full training camp as well, couldn't beat him? I disagree. I think Masvidal would beat Usman. If we're talking about a Masvidal in his prime versus the current state of Usman, I'm going to go with Jorge Masvidal at the beginning of 2020 to beat Kamaru Usman as of today. Then we've got Leon Edwards 5 years ago versus current JDM. There's an argument to make that current JDM beats current Leon Edwards, so I think the JDM of today would definitely beat the Leon Edwards of 5 years ago. I think it would still be a competitive fight. I'm not saying that Leon was washed or was a terrible fighter 5 years ago and hadn't evolved, but I think JDM of today, with the striking that he's got and even the underrated grappling, would keep this fight standing, and I think would just rough up Leon Edwards with the boxing. I'm picking current JDM to beat Edwards for 5 years ago. So that's the welterweight division. There's a couple of fighters from 5 years ago that I think would have success over today's fighters, like a Jorge Masvidal over current Usman, like a prime Usman over current Bilal Muhammad. But I think apart from that, a lot of today's welterweights would have success over the welterweights from 5 years ago, keeping up with the trend that modern fighters have definitely evolved. Then we've got the lightweight division. Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Islam Makhachev. This is a massive debate between the two of them. Who would win between Khabib and who would win between Islam Makhachev? And it seems to be Khabib that gets a lot of the answers, but I really do feel like Makhachev would win this fight. I get that Khabib's a better wrestler than Islam Makhachev. I understand that. But I don't think Khabib's wrestling is that much better to the point where he could dominate and control the fight with his wrestling against Islam Makhachev, who's definitely the second best wrestler we've seen in the lightweight division. But I do think Makhachev's striking is so far ahead of Khabib's striking where he could change the fight in his favor with his striking, if you know what I mean. So I feel like this fight will be a lot of Khabib threatening Makhachev with the grappling, and Makhachev keeping the fight standing, and just having a lot of success with Khabib on the feet. I'm picking Makhachev to win this one by a close decision with the striking, keeping the fight standing. I'm just beating Khabib with the stand-up alone, so I'm going to go with Makhachev to win this fight against Khabib. And then we've got Tony Ferguson from 5 years ago, just as he entered the losing streak against current Arman Tsarukyan. Now, Tony Ferguson wasn't washed at this stage. Yes, he just had that massive roughed-up fight with Justin Gaethje, which broke him, but he was still coming off that 2019 and that massive 12-fight winning streak. But the sport has evolved, especially in a division like 155, and I think Tsarukyan would definitely beat Tony Ferguson. The stand-up would be a competitive fight, but I think the wrestling of Arman Tsarukyan would definitely pose a lot of threats to Tony Ferguson. Beats him with the wrestling, probably beats him with the stand-up too. I'm picking current Arman Tsarukyan to beat Tony Ferguson from 5 years ago. I mean, there's a debate to say that current Arman Tsarukyan, could potentially beat current Islam Makhachev. So I think the 2020 version of Ferguson would lose to the current version of Tsarukyan. Then we've got Dustin Poirier from 5 years ago versus current Oliveira. I mean, we saw the fight with Dustin Poirier against a much lesser version of Oliveira, and Oliveira was able to submit him. There's an argument you can make to say that Poirier's evolved, but I feel like we've seen a lot more adjustments from Oliveira since their first fight, like the wrestling that he showed in that fight with Michael Chandler, where he was taking down Michael Chandler. So I feel like the fight would go very similar. Charles Oliveira makes it a competitive fight in the stand-up, eventually takes Dustin Poirier down or gets him to the ground, and eventually submits Dustin Poirier. So I'm going to go with current Charles Oliveira to beat Poirier from 5 years ago. Then we've got Conor McGregor, who was still in the top 5 years ago, against current Justin Gaethje. I mean, McGregor from 5 years ago looked awful. You know, I mean, I know this was 2021 that we're talking about rather than 2020. He was more in the welterweight division in 2020, but he fought Dustin Poirier in the lightweight division in 2020. Didn't look amazing in that fight. You put him in against Justin Gaethje as of nowadays, it would be I guess it would be a lot more competitive. I mean, 100% it'd be a lot more competitive than if they were both fighting nowadays, but I'm still going to lean towards Justin Gaethje by stoppage. I think Gaethje would just be overwhelming for Conor McGregor. I know he hasn't got the same technical advantage that Dustin Poirier did over McGregor, but I feel like the toughness of Justin Gaethje, the fact that he's so powerful, the fact that he's just such a, you know, just a weird fighter to deal with. I'm picking Justin Gaethje to overwhelm and completely smother Conor McGregor in the stand-up and beat him. I'm going current Justin Gaethje to beat McGregor from 5 years ago. Then we've got Justin Gaethje from 5 years ago versus Dustin Poirier as of today. We saw them fight in 2018. Dustin Poirier got the stoppage. Now, we saw them fight in 2023. Justin Gaethje got the stoppage. But I think if you put current Dustin Poirier against Gaethje from 5 years ago, I'm picking Poirier to win. I'm not saying that the win that Gaethje got over Poirier was fluky, but I still feel like Dustin Poirier is the better lightweight out of the two. That if you put them against each other 10 times, I think Dustin Poirier wins the vast majority of them. And yeah, I'm just going to pick him to win against the Justin Gaethje from 5 years ago, who was a lot more chaotic, a lot less technical. So I'm going to go with current Dustin Poirier to beat Justin Gaethje by some sort of knockout. And then we've got, oh yeah, that is the lightweight division. So yeah, the lightweight division is where you can kind of start to see the competitive nature change. The only lightweight from 5 years ago to beat, well, actually, no, none of the lightweights from 5 years ago I would favor to beat any of the lightweights as of today. So this is where we start to see the evolution of the game, where today's lightweights dominate the lightweights from 5 years ago. Then we've got the featherweight division. Alexander Volkanovski in 2020 versus 2025 to Poirier. There's a bit of a debate going on that prime Volkanovski would put up a much different fight than the Volkanovski that fought to Poirier, but I don't even think 2020 Volkanovski was prime Volk. I think prime Volk was 2022/2023. This was when Volk was just getting his feet wet in the featherweight division, so I'm going to go with Topuria to win this fight as well. Topuria's in the prime of his life. I know technically he's not the featherweight champion, but he still is on the website, so I'm counting him as the champion. But yeah, Topuria's in the prime of his life. Knocked out Alexander Volk and Max Holloway, undefeated, really good wrestling, amazing boxing, power as well, got literally no weaknesses. And 2020 Volkanovski, that was coming off that really close fight with Max Holloway. I'm picking current Topuria to beat Alexander Volkanovski from 2020. Volkanovski hadn't hit his prime yet. Topuria's in his prime. Topuria by stoppage. Then we've got Max Holloway from 5 years ago versus Alexander Volkanovski as of today. Now, this was when Max Holloway was putting on competitive fights with Volkanovski, and if we're talking about the current Volkanovski that's not in his prime and arguably is a little bit washed, I'm still going to go with current Volkanovski to win this one, because we saw the fight 2 years ago, and the fight was so one-favoured and just one-dimensional in Alexander Volkanovski's favour. He dominated this fight so badly. I've got to pick him to win again. If this would have been a really close fight, I would have been leaning towards Max Holloway from 5 years ago to beat Alexander Volkanovski as of today, but because the fight was so dominant in Volkanovski's favour, and he has only really lost to Topuria, who also knocked out Max Holloway, and Islam Makhachev, who would beat Max Holloway. Alexander Volkanovski as of today wouldn't dominate, but would still beat Max Holloway as of the 2020 version. And then we've got Zabit Magomedsharipov, one of the biggest what-ifs in the UFC versus Max Holloway as of today. Zabit was a big prospect. It would have been good to see him continue, but he had a lot of flaws. His gas tank was a massive flaw. We started to see him kind of struggle as the competition increased when he fought the likes of Jeremy Stephens and Calvin Kattar, and I think you put him in there with an absolute dog in Max Holloway, who could keep that volume pace on him for 5 rounds straight, who would have been by far the best striker that Zabit would have fought and would have broke him in the cardio department. I'm picking current Max Holloway to not only beat Zabit Magomedsharipov, but to kind of dominate him in the stand-up. I feel like Zabit, as crafty as he was, Holloway's a terrible fight. A guy that can capitalize on that bad stamina with that volume strike, and a guy that can take you to deep waters, a guy that is much better than you in the stand-up department. I'm picking current Holloway to beat Magomedsharipov for 2020. Then we had Korean Zombie from 5 years ago versus Diego Lopez. Another tough one to pick, because Korean Zombie was a dangerous dude, but if we're talking about 2020 Korean Zombie, he wasn't necessarily washed at the time, but he definitely wasn't in his prime. I'd say the washed Korean Zombie was, you know, that late 2021, 2022 era when he was fighting the likes of Volkanovski and Max Holloway. But I'm going to go with Diego Lopez to win. I feel like the sport has evolved. Diego Lopez with the powerful striking, with the jiu-jitsu, arguably could be the next featherweight champion if he beats Alexander Volkanovski. The fact that he's so dangerous everywhere the fight goes against a more older Korean zombie. I'm going to go with Diego Lopez to beat Korean zombie, but it's not an easy pick, you know. Diego Lopez is a bit of an all-guns blazing fighter, very chaotic, maybe a guy in Korean zombie who's dangerous, both with the submission and the stand-up, just like Lopez. Could capitalize on it, but I'm leaning towards Diego Lopez to beat Korean zombie. Then we've got Yair Rodriguez from 5 years ago to beat Kuramov Evloev. Terrible matchup for Yair Rodriguez. Evloev dominates him in the wrestling. Evloev is the best wrestler right now in the featherweight division. Yair Rodriguez has some of the worst grappling right now in the featherweight division. Goes without saying. Evloev takes him down and mauls him for 3 rounds. Movsar Evloev beats Yair Rodriguez. And that's the featherweight division again. A lot of the featherweights as of today comfortably beat the featherweights from 5 years ago. The only featherweight as of today that I would favour to beat a featherweight from 5 years ago is probably current Volkanovski versus Max Holloway, and that's because we've seen him go 3-0 against Max Holloway, with the third one being the most decisive. So featherweight again showing the trend a lot, especially in the smaller weight classes. Fighters tend to be evolving more nowadays. Anyway, then we've got the bantamweight division. Henry Cejudo is the bantamweight champion versus current Merab. Now, we did see this fight last year. Merab beat Cejudo very comfortably, but obviously that wasn't prime Cejudo. Cejudo retired in his prime, still to this day one of the worst decisions, but I'm still going to go with Merab. I feel like from a skills perspective, Merab might be the most skilled bantamweight we've ever seen. I really can't see anybody beating Merab, especially after that performance against Umar Nurmagomedov. The fact that he can keep that pace over 5 rounds, it looks like he could go 10. The fact that he's wrestling so good and he's shown it against Henry Cejudo. I'm picking Merab to beat him. Definitely a much more competitive fight, especially with the career stage that Cejudo was in. But I've got no reason to pick Cejudo over Merab. Retired too early to see him get really tested in that bantamweight division against the other top opposition, which we could have seen him fight if he hadn't retired so early. The fact that we've seen him lose to Merab before, tougher fight for Merab than it was the first time, but I'm still going to go with Merab to beat 2020 Henry Cejudo. Then we've got Marlon Moraes versus Sean O'Malley. One of the most dangerous strikers that we've seen in the bantamweight division versus a guy that couldn't stop getting TKO'd. It goes without saying. I'm going to go with Sean O'Malley to knock out Marlon Moraes. Like I said, goes without saying. A dangerous, long, rangy, and elite striker versus a very chinny and beatable Marlon Moraes. Sean O'Malley knocks out Moraes, especially the current version of O'Malley. 2020 Aljamain Sterling versus current PTN. Well, PTN from 5 years ago, which I would say is not much of an evolved version of PTN, was whooping Sterling in the first fight up until the DQ, and arguably beat him in the second fight. You're talking about 2020 Sterling versus the modern day PTN, which seems to have much better wrestling. I'm picking PTN to win. I'm picking PTN to win, maybe by a stoppage, but at least with the decision. He seems like he's improved his wrestling a lot as PTN, as he showed in that fight with, you know, Sean O'Malley, as he showed in the fight with Song Yudong, as he showed in the fight with his most recent fight with Davison Figueiredo. And Sterling back in 2020 having those extremely close fights with PTN and not really evolving as much. I'm picking 2025 PTN to beat Sterling from 5 years ago. Then we've got Umar Nurmagomedov as of today versus PTN 5 years ago. Well, like I just said, I don't know if PTN's wrestling was that good 5 years ago compared to as it is now. And Umar Nurmagomedov being a very close second to the best wrestler we've got right now in this division. And PTN historically struggles with wrestlers. He struggled with Sterling. He struggled with Merab. I mean, he got dominated by Merab. It does seem to be historically that PTN struggles with wrestlers. You put him against Umar Nurmagomedov, who's one of the best wrestlers of the modern generation in the bantamweight division, or just bantamweight history, if we're being honest. I think Nurmagomedov would pick up a decision over PTN, taking him down round after round. We saw how badly Merab dominated PTN. I can only imagine that a Nurmagomedov of today would do much better against a lesser version of PTN from 5 years ago. I'm picking Umar Nurmagomedov to get a decision win over PTN. And then we've got Rafael Assunção versus Corey Sandhagen. This is where we start to see the decline of Rafael. He should have retired long before 2020 against current Corey Sandhagen, who's still one of the most skilled fighters in the UFC. Corey Sandhagen knocks him out, in my opinion. Assunção was getting knocked out by the likes of Cody Garbrandt. He was on a big decline in his career. You put him against a very well-rounded and a primed Corey Sandhagen as of today. Sandhagen gets him out there quickly. I'm picking Sandhagen to knock out Assunção. And that's the bantamweight division again. We're starting to see a big kind of evolution, especially in the bantamweight division, which is arguably the most skilled division in the UFC, that every single one of today's bantamweights, in my opinion, would be every single bantamweight in the top 5 from 5 years ago, and which just shows the evolution of the sport. In only 5 years, I know it's the bantamweight division, which is the most skilled division in the UFC, but again, I feel like the sport has evolved, especially in a division like bantamweight. Most of today's bantamweights, especially in the top 5, would dominate the bantamweights from 5 years ago. Then the flyweight division. Now, the flyweight belt was vacant 5 years ago, but the most recent champion was Cejudo, so I'm going to count Cejudo as the flyweight champion against current Alejandro Pantoja. This is one of the toughest ones I've had to do so far. because Cejudo's a terrible fight for Pantoja. Cejudo had decent striking in the flyweight division. He wasn't a bad striker, and he had the wrestling to go with it, which I think he would have been able to keep the fight standing. But I'm still going to go with Alejandro Pantoja. I'm still going to go with Pantoja. It was only a couple of fights after he won the belt for Cejudo when he was losing to the likes of Joseph a couple of fights before he won the belt when he was losing to the likes of Joseph Benavidez. And I'm picking Pantoja, who's the second greatest flyweight of all time, a guy who finds a way to win in every single one of his fights, to beat Cejudo from 5 years ago. An extremely tough fight, but I feel like Pantoja will be able to make it scrappy. He would have been able to put up a much better fight than the likes of, a TJ Dillashaw who Cejudo was fighting. So I'm picking current Pantoja to beat Cejudo in a very, very close and tough fight to pick. But I'm going to go with current Pantoja, the second greatest flyweight of, just in history. Then we've got Davison Figueiredo from 5 years ago to beat current Brandon Royval. Figgy, one of the most underrated flyweights of all time. Figgy choked Royval out. Figgy was, and still is, one of the best fighters in the world, at least in the lower weight classes. Powerful striker, really good striker with the jiu-jitsu threat to go with it. I think would be a nightmare for Brandon Royval. So I'm picking Davison Figueiredo to choke out Brandon Royval, who's #1 today. Listen, Royval does decent. He doesn't do terrible against grapplers. I mean, he was getting taken down by the likes of Tatsuro Taira and Pantoja, and he is a good volume striker, but Figueiredo's a nightmare matchup. A powerful striker with good striking who can match you on the feet and also take you down. Easy fight for Figgy. Figgy gets to finish against Brandon Royval. Then we've got Joseph Benavidez versus Brandon Moreno. Benavidez, he got destroyed by Figueiredo. Absolutely destroyed in the rematch with Figgy. And you put him against current version of Brandon Moreno, I think Moreno would at least dominate him to a decision. At least completely, just swipe a unanimous decision over Benavidez by just the volume striking, the boxing of Brandon Moreno, piecing up Benavidez. And if not, getting a stoppage, maybe getting a knockout over Benavidez. Domination from Brandon Moreno. And then we had Jussier Formiga versus Amir Albazi. Again, Formiga was in the later stage of his career where he was getting stopped. I think Amir Albazi, I probably wouldn't pick Albazi to get a stoppage. He's not really a stoppage type of guy as Albazi. And he just did get dominated by Brandon Moreno. But the fact that he had that very good performance against Kakar Frampton, which I didn't think he would, but he still had a very close fight with him. I'm going to go with Amir Albazi, the much more evolved flyweight, to beat an old Formiga. And then we had Pantoja from 5 years ago versus current Kakar of France. Now, I know I just went on that rant saying that Pantoja's in the, the best flyweight, or the second best flyweight of all time, but Pantoja from 5 years ago wasn't as evolved. And I actually think that Kakar of France is a nightmare matchup for Pantoja, because Ira France, coming from that City Kickboxing gym, has really good takedown defense, and the power of Kakar France would have been terrible for a guy like Pantoja, who was a lot less defensively sound 5 years ago, charging at people with his chin wide up in the air, having a very scrappy but a much less technical style on the feet. I really do feel like you put current Kakar France with the takedown defense and the power against Pantoja from 5 years ago, he would knock out Pantoja and get the victory. But that is how I would match up every flyweight, or every top 5 in every division from 5 years ago against the top 5 from nowadays. Let me know if you agree, disagree. Thank you for watching.